Hello and welcome to One and All. I'm Dan Leach, and I couldn't be happier to be hosting Revolutionizing Diabetes Care. Discover the future of continuous glucose monitoring with Paul Good, PhD, the president and CEO of Glucotrack. Glucotrack is developing a fully implantable investigational continuous blood glucose monitor, or CBGM, a next-generation system designed to measure glucose directly from the blood without any on-body components, and with the potential to last up to 3 years, which is simply amazing. Fresh off successful first-in-human trials, this webinar will dive into the science, the breakthrough results, and what lies ahead for this novel approach to glucose monitoring. It is my pleasure to welcome in President and CEO of Glucotrack, Paul Good, PhD.
Hi, Dan. Good to meet you.
Hey, it's so great to be with you today, Paul. Well, let's jump right in. Let's talk about what the current state of glucose monitoring is right now.
Okay, so we could jump to slide 5. Glucotrack, glucose monitoring. Just to give some context, let's go back and look at a little bit of history. But insulin was discovered just a little over 100 years ago. But it wasn't for another 30 years that there was some technique at all to measure one's glucose values. And that came about in around 1950 with urine test strips. And believe it or not, technology didn't change for almost 30 years again until the very conventional finger stick devices that I think we're all pretty much familiar with, where people lancet their finger and put a drop of blood on a strip. And that came in the late 70s. And those are still in use today, although their use is declining as continuous glucose monitoring has began to take more priority. The first continuous glucose monitoring system, or CGM, was launched in 1999 by a company called MiniMed, now Medtronic Diabetes. And it was kind of like a Holter monitor. So the patient would wear this, not know what the values were, and 3 days later return the device back to the doc, and the doc would analyze the data. Fast forward a few years, that technology evolved with more players coming on the scene, and that technology becoming a home use where the patients could actually see their glucose values. So since then, roughly the last 20 years, we've had home use CGM where patients can see their values and treat their diabetes. And it's been a very good technology. And the big advance that it has above and beyond the blood glucose meters is in the next slide. You'll see that there is, when you look at the data, it looks like the graph didn't show up well here, but effectively, when the blood glucose values are a single point in time, so you have no idea as a patient whether your glucose is rising or whether it's falling. And you may have a reading that is close to the low end of normal, and you may think, oh gosh, I'm about to go very low. I don't want to get dizzy and that sort of thing and have a hypoglycemic event, so I'll drink some orange juice. And that would be the correct call to make if you are trending down. But if you're trending upwards, you wouldn't want to do that because you're already on the rise with glucose, and then you may overshoot and go into a high glucose range. Similarly, the same thing happens with, if you're on the edge of high glucose and you're rising, then yeah, you would definitely want to treat with insulin. But if you're falling at that point, you would not want to treat with insulin, because then you could way undershoot and get into a hypoglycemic event and get dizzy, maybe even pass out. And that could be quite dangerous. So having those values, those trends added to those values is very, very valuable. And in addition, by having that continuous data stream, you can get alerts. And so when you do go cross over into the high zone or down into the low zone, an alert can pop up in case you're unaware physiologically that that's happening, which is commonly the case. You can intervene much sooner. So, taking the next step into trying to understand what these sensors look like, moving to the next slide, we can see what a typical CGM system looks like today. This is the current state of the art. These are little devices that are typically worn on the back of the arm. They're also worn maybe in the abdominal space as well, or some other places like the lower back, but most commonly on the back of the arm. They're a very small device that has an adhesive and a needle, and an applicator is used to insert this into the back of the arm or wherever it's being used, and the adhesive sticks the body on there. The applicator removes the needle with it and leaves behind a little sensing filament that has the glucose sensing capability on it. Inside the the little penny-shaped housing of the device, are electronics that measure the glucose and transmit that data via Bluetooth to a person's smartphone, and then that goes data off, of course, as well to the cloud. Diving in a bit deeper into this, the next slide will show what the insides of this look like, and it's a circuit board with conventional electronics and a battery. So that is very, very common, microelectronics type of stuff, and very low cost. So they need to make these relatively low cost, so patients don't pay much for these. And where the cost does come in, of course, is in a lot of the chemistry that goes to the sensing filament. And you can see a little zoom up of that on the bottom right of this particular screen. That's the part that actually goes under the skin and has the chemistry that measures glucose. But this is the the conventional build of pretty much every one of these sensors, and they're made in very high volumes, and patients are getting a lot of benefit from them.
And I mentioned I personally had to deal with the fingerprint thing, so new things are obviously exciting for me and many others, and that just leads into what I wanted to ask you next. Why do you feel, and I think you explained a lot there as well, but why do you feel the market needs a new CGM?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you go to the next slide, slide 10, there's, just in general, there's a lot of, just covering diabetes to start with. I mean, in the US, 1 out of 10 patients have diabetes. So it's a huge, huge problem. And you say, okay, well, your blood sugars are high. Yeah, I mean, I can live with high blood sugar. It doesn't, unless it's a low blood sugar and I'm about to pass out, which is, a minority of the cases. I can live with my high blood sugar. It doesn't give me a headache, doesn't make me feel nauseous. I can just, deal with it. But there are so many problems that diabetes causes in other indications, like, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, even blindness. So it affects all of our organs in a different way. So there's still a need to try to reduce those burdens by properly monitoring one's blood sugars if they have diabetes. And if you look at the next slide, you can see that the growth rate of CGM has really been rather exponential. And as you can see here, it finished in 2024 with 11.6 billion in annual revenues, and just on CGM alone. And so it's quite large, and half of that's US, half of that is OUS. But then you think about it like, well, not even 60% yet of the market is penetrated. And actually, if you look at the market trends, you see that that those particular markets, which is type 1 patients, type 2 patients, diabetes patients, that they're beginning to plateau out. And the question is why? Why is that happening? And when you look at it, what are the barriers to adoption? And so the next slide highlights those, where you can see that primarily, it's a combination of things, but in one form or another, for the most part, it is that it's a temporary device. You have to replace the sensor every 10 to 15 days. It can fall off, or it can irritate your skin, through adhesive, reactions to the adhesive. And there's a management factor of getting these devices, going through the pre-authorization process, getting them shipped to you. If you're going on vacation, you need to carry so many with you. Even if you're going to be out of the home for 12 hours and you're on your last day of your sensor wear, do you replace it, or do you keep it going and hope you get another day out of it? But you don't want to be left without it. So you have to carry one with you just to be safe to the work, to the office, or to school, or wherever. And then, of course, there's also, these sensors do have a delay because they're not measuring in the blood, which the fingerstick devices do. They're measuring, under the skin in what's called the interstitial fluid, and there is a delay there. The sensors do a very good job of measuring in the interstitial fluid, but during a rapid rates of change like exercise or eating or stress or illness, which these things can happen, sometimes multiple times a day, there can be up to a 15-minute delay, which can be very important when trying to manage one's glycemic levels. So market research has dug into this deeper. There's a diabetes market research firm who looked at, they do an annual roundup. They do all kinds of diabetes, med tech and diabetes pharma, and that's their specialty. And they do an annual roundup on all of these technologies and drugs. And CGM had a massive, I would say, sea change in 2017 because of three main factors. One is they had a reimbursement came in the U.S. In particular. Number two was that you no longer needed to use these finger sticks to calibrate the device. And then thirdly, you no longer needed to use the finger sticks to confirm the device's readings. So in 2017, there was this huge change. So we asked this firm, we said, all right, let's look at your annual roundup from 2018, a year after this. And what were the biggest, needs or desires of patients on the technology in 2018, a year later from this, as well as 5 years after that. So if you move to the next slide, you could see that there, we said, look, we want anything that scored above 20%, and you can see that, there's 6 reasons, and the same 6 reasons prevail in 2023 as they did in 2020 or 2018, excuse me, and the voices are actually a little bit louder. And this is not from just 50 or 100 patients, but this is from thousands. And when you look at the variety of reasons there's 6. One of them, of course, is the complaints about transmission distance, and we all have those frustrations with our Bluetooth devices. But out of the other 5, 4 of those 5 are the fact that the device is a wearable. And in one form or another, it's the fact that they have a wearable challenge to them. And then the other one is of course accuracy, and this is kind of what I mentioned earlier about measuring in the interstitial fluid versus measuring in the blood. About a third of the patients, and we've spoken to diabetologists, educators who try to train and treat patients on how to manage this. About a third of the patients do struggle with understanding this delay and how to incorporate it. And some just feel like, well, my finger stick says this and my sensor says that. They're not aligned. Therefore, the sensor, the CGM is wrong. And that's a misconception that it's wrong, because it's not. But there's that sense. So those are the barriers of what we see in CGM adoption and what the market sees. And so we hope to bring something different for patients.
No, that's such important points that you made there. And this is the exciting part. Let's talk about how Glucotrack is redefining the future of continuous glucose monitoring.
Yeah. So our goal is, we want to be able to offer patients, something that they don't presently have, because everything out there right now effectively is a better mousetrap, if you will, right? It's more of the same. And these manufacturers, they've done a wonderful job where they've taken it. And I should have said on the previous slide, even though those voices are louder in all of those 6 areas, the manufacturers have actually made improvements in all of those 6 areas. So then they've done a phenomenal job. But there's still enough patients who can't or won't use one of these wearable technologies. So where we come in is we want to offer them a solution that overcomes the wearability factor. And we do that by having an implantable sensor. And by going implantable, of course, obviously, you don't have to deal with replacing the device, every 10 to 15 days. You don't have to worry about adhesive issues and devices falling off or itching or what have you. There's no wearable that goes on the body whatsoever. So it's fully implantable, transmits data straight to the smartphone, so that you have a wear-free comfort. And then because we're in the body, we can actually measure blood if we like. So we actually measure in the blood, and more on that a little bit later. But we're doing a blood measurement, so we don't have that delay factor. And it's also a big plus just in terms of both the patient and the clinician, or the, I'd say, healthcare provider and their staff, in terms of their management of these devices. That's one of the biggest complaints we hear from healthcare providers is the pre-authorization process they have to go through every 6 months for every patient. It's a lot of work, and not to mention constantly training patients on how to use the device and how to deal with certain wearability issues. So our device, if you look at the next slide, is basically really standing on the shoulders of giants. We have a device that goes inside the body, and you look on the right, that little picture there is where our device is, and the catheter or lead portion goes into a blood vessel. And while all that may sound unique, it's actually not. It's unique to CGM for sure, but it's not unique to healthcare. The electronics package of our device, that little silver portion, long skinny silver portion, is just like an insertable loop monitor or a implantable Holter monitor. There's about 100,000 of those implanted every year in the U.S. And so this goes in the same way, same materials, same techniques, and constructed the same way. And we designed it that way so we can leverage that. Likewise, the part that goes into the blood vessel, it's very similar to a cardiac pacemaker lead, but instead of going all the way into the heart and anchoring to the cardiac tissue, we just go 2 inches into the blood vessel and float there, no anchoring. But the access to get to it is very similar, same tools, again, same materials. We're just, again, leveraging what's out there. It's been out there for decades, known how to do, and applying it to CGM. And then, of course, on that physical construct, we're adding our chemistry. And that chemistry, while we've done something unique to make it last for over 3 years, we're using the same type or class of chemistry as all those that are worn on body. So we believe we've done a very, very concerted effort to de-risk technical and clinical and regulatory and even to some degree reimbursement by riding on the coattails of those that have come before us, both in cardiovascular as well as in diabetes.
That's pretty incredible stuff, Paul. Obviously respect to the past, but an eye on the future. And like I always like to say, what a time to be alive. It's just really awesome what you guys are doing. Let's, if we can, Paul, talk about the results of the clinical testing.
Sure. So we finished our first in-human trial. Our first focus clinically was, of course, proving that the device that goes into the blood vessel is, it's safe to implant. It's safe while it's implanted. It functions while it's implanted, because the chemistry is there, and it's safe to explant. And of course, we also need to prove, of course, longevity. But we could accomplish, the first 4 of those 5 objectives with a temporary study, and that's what we did here. We did a small study in Sao Paulo, Brazil, at INCOR Institute, which is ranked typically number 1 as the best cardiovascular institute in all of Latin America. And we chose a cardiovascular institute because a cardiovascular specialist, would be implanting, the lead, inserting the lead. And, it's a local anesthesia, outpatient type of a procedure done in the cath lab, about 20 minutes typically. And that is, so we had that lead inserted, and then we had it connected to externalized electronics. And we had the patient kept in the hospital for 4 days, and measured, their results, and then of course removed. And so the results of that, which are on the next slide, is that we found that, yeah, indeed, it was very safe. We met our primary endpoint. We had no serious adverse events due to the device or to the procedure. We had also, our secondary events that we were hoping to achieve, which we did, is that, again, it's a simple procedure. Data capture and, Bluetooth was well. We had 99% capture rate. But, the big thing is, of course, device performance. And we had, very good accuracy measurement in these patients, both during normal times as well as during fast transient times. And, that graph below, you can see that over a 36-hour period in one particular subject. And the accuracy values are definitely, comparable, maybe, slightly better than what's out there on the market. But at the end of the day, of course, this is a much smaller group of patients, and the other competitors are doing this day in and day out on, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of patients every day. So, but we believe that as a first study, we have incredibly good results. We're very excited with these results, and it shows a lot of promise for the next step that we do plan on taking, and that would be our next step in our clinical development, which is to do a larger study, multiple centers, and that would be in slide 21. We're targeting a center in two centers in Melbourne, Australia, potentially adding a third, and they have experience with implantable continuous glucose sensors as well as non-implantable continuous glucose sensors. We're looking at, again, 2 sites, possibly 3, and up to 30 participants. And we'll have the fully implantable system in the patients, follow them for a year. We expect the results, of course, because we expect this to be a 3-year sensor. So we expect after a year, the results to continue to be good, at which point we will see about extending the study to longer than a year and get ethics approval for that. But as it stands today, we already have ethics committee and regulatory approval to start this study in Australia. We've got the protocol finalized. We're working out final details with the sites, and we expect to be implanting patients in July of this year. So we're really excited to get that study going. And so that kind of leads into our regulatory timeline to give the users a bit more of a broader look. So on the next slide is focuses on 2025. And we finished our first in human, as shown on the next slide. We finished our first in human earlier this year, and we're going to be starting this OUS study in July, and we'll get a nice readout at 3 months on that data, which will be, and of course we'll continue to follow as well. But our first major readout will be at 3 months, and then. On the U.S. side of the fence, which is on the lower part of this graph, of this bar, you can see we actually did submit to the FDA for a pre-sub to start basically the same trial, a little bit more patients and more sites, but to do the same trial in the U.S. And we've already had good dialogue with the FDA. They've been super responsive, much sooner than we expected, and we're pleased with that. And our objective is to work out through the pre-sub process all the fine details with the agency, and such that we can do a formal submission near the end of the year, and then get approval, before December 31st strikes midnight, and get approval then. So that's and then rolling into the subsequent years, which will be on the next slide. We'll continue to get readouts on these data. Again, on the next slide, we'll see that in 2026 and 2027, we will get more readouts on the long-term Australian study as well as on the pilot study, and we'll also be doing a pivotal submission, to the FDA. Do a submission for a pivotal trial to get approval to start that. Now that trial would be for our commercial approval, and thank you. There it is. And so we will be working on that early next year, and expect to start that enrollment, a little more than a year from now, and then leveraging the data from previous studies, and then we would continue the study and target regulatory approval for mid-2028. Why at that point? We're looking to get a 1-year indication. Even though it's a 3-year device, we expect that the FDA will say, well, if you're going to claim 3 years, then run your study for 3 years. And that's a fair ask. And so we're going to start with a 1-year approval and try to work with the FDA to see if we can continue to follow those patients after the 1-year approval and amend it for a 2-year longevity and a 3-year longevity, so forth. So that's our regulatory pathway towards approval and extending our longevity.
Well, you mentioned, Paul, you were excited. You're getting me excited. I know you're getting a lot of people watching excited. It's fascinating, very important stuff. It's going to change the world, and that's kind of what I want to lead you to here. When you look at Glucotrack, why do you feel like it will change the game?
Yeah, good question. one is, I learned a long time ago in my career that it doesn't matter how great of a product you think you have or what you designed, or, you can bend the laws of physics if you want to, but if the end user doesn't want the device, it's not going anywhere. And so we did early on, we said, you know what, we got to do our homework. We got to make sure that this is something that patients want first and foremost. And then we also got to understand, do physicians want this as well, right? Because they're the gateway to the patients typically. And they can dissuade or persuade patients accordingly. So early on, we were a 2-year longevity sensor. We've since increased that to 3 years. But when we were 2 years, and before we really committed heavy dollars to this, we did this research, and we queried over 750 patients with diabetes across the spectrum, type 1, type 2, tech users, non-tech users, and so forth. And we used that same diabetes marketing firm that I had mentioned earlier, and we were very transparent about the procedure and how long it would take, and how it would go in, where it would go in, and so forth. And we saw that, over 50% of the patients responded very favorably to accepting of the technology. Now, we do realize, it's a questionnaire, and, when push comes to shove, do we expect, 1 out of 2 patients, to do this? That it remains to be seen, but that would be an optimistic view, I would say. But we do think that that this is promising enough that even if a fraction of these are interested in actually having the device when push comes to shove, then there's still it's a very meaningful business, but B, again, it's a solution for patients who don't have one right now or are looking for something better. Now, on the physician side, we also, we realize most of these patients are managed by endocrinologists or primary care physicians. So we also queried them and asked, what they're like, what likelihood they would have for prescribing this. And, the primary care physicians, came out, almost 90% of them said, sure, yeah, we definitely prescribe this. And for the endocrinologists, who are a bit more of a reserved and conservative group in the clinician community, and they're not proceduralists in general, they came in a little bit less, but still, over 70% said, yeah, I refer this to patients. And so, and those numbers we think are probably, more reflective of what would be seen when push does come to shove. So that was very encouraging. And again, and put it in the context of that this was a whole new technology, a whole new concept for CGM for these physicians to when they first even hear about it. So we expect these numbers both on the patient side and on the physician side to increase as we continue to go through our clinical trials and report on successful data and demonstrate the clinical utility of having this. Another big benefit both to physicians and to patients is that once this device is in, the patient and the clinician are getting 24/7 data, 365 days a year, in our case, 3 years. And that's, whereas with the wearable devices, it is not 24/7. The devices last for, 7, 10, 15 days, depending on which one you buy. But, the sensors can fall off. The patients can decide, I'm going to a wedding this weekend. I don't want to be monitoring my glucose. So, they take a 2-day holiday, or they take a whole week off around Thanksgiving, or what have you, right? Right. So there are those scenarios that go away by having this technology as well. So we think a lot of these things are going to bubble up and help promote the case for having a fully implantable system. We think we're going to take a decent part of the remaining market share that hasn't been touched. So, if you migrate, to the next slide, we're really trying to target those who can't or won't use CGM today. Those are really, the driver is to try to, we're not trying to pick a fight with the big guys. They've done a marvelous job. They really have. And patients that are comfortable with those technologies should continue to use them. But for those who can't or won't, or those who want something more than they currently have, that may be frustrated with some of the wearability factors or what have you, we're happy to take on those patients. And another big plus that we have is we're lucky. Again, we have to give give our gratitude to those companies that were blazing this trail before us, the CGM companies that were blazing that trail before us, because, CGM is now standard of care. Physicians expect it. They understand it. Patients, are getting more and more comfortable with it, especially certain groups of diabetes patients. And reimbursement is there, so a lot of that sort of, upstream, battling that those companies had to do, we get to ride those coattails, and we're grateful to them for that. So we think that, that definitely helps us. And also we're riding the coattails of those in the cardiovascular industry who've developed these techniques and devices for, since the 70s, and, for pacing, or actually even before the 70s, and since the late 90s for the loop monitors. And because we can, ride these coattails, it really de-risks our entire business case. Starting to de-risk technology, it de-risks materials, it de-risks supply chain, it de-risks clinical risk, regulatory risk, and even to some degree, even reimbursement risk, which, reimbursement is always a challenge, but it even de-risks some of that. So, compared to any other new company that's bringing a new technology to market, whether it's implantable or not implantable, that needs to be adopted. We feel that, we're much more de-risked and positioned to very rapidly get to market in a safe way through the FDA process, as well as then to scale from there post-clearance, FDA clearance into commercialization.
No, yeah, you got to feel really good where you're at. And really, by the way, you kind of explained it. In many ways, it's like a global medical village, if you will, and you're all kind of trying to help everybody. We have a couple audience questions for the viewers, and Paul, if we can get to those, is that all right?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
All right. Nick in Wichita wanted me to ask which patients are you planning this technology to be appropriate for?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question that we're going to be targeting initially. I say it's the $1 million question. I'll get to that in a second, but the short answer is insulin dependent patients. So type 1 and type 2 patients with type 1 and type 2 diabetes that are dependent on insulin, whether it's intensive insulin management or basal, just routine insulin management. That's the initial target. And that's what we're enrolling in our clinical trials. The reason why I say it's the $1 million question is that there is a strong case to be made for also, targeting, the non-insulin dependent type 2 market. And, those patients, can benefit from a set it and forget it type of an approach as well. And that is a very large market. But our initial target will be those that are insulin dependent.
I think the next one is a great question from Franklin in Chicago. He wanted me to ask you, can you explain more about the implantation procedure? I was curious about that as well.
Oh yeah, I didn't elaborate on that as I should have. So yeah, thank you for that question.
You did a great job, Paul. Let's be honest.
I appreciate that. So the device goes in. So it's done in a cardiac catheterization lab, where they typically do cardiac pacemaker implants or atrial fibrillation therapies or stent deliveries and things like that. Those are commonly outpatient procedures. This will be also. So you go into the cardiac cath lab, you'll be prepped. There'll be in this region, in the pectoral region, there'll be some lidocaine that'll be injected to numb the tissue. And then there'll be a technique that is used again, just like delivering a cardiac pacemaker. Just not as many steps or as aggressive. I won't say aggressive, that's wrong. It's not the right word, but it doesn't go as far as a cardiac pacemaker. So the lead will go in, just near the armpit area and the axillary vein, and it'll be advanced just 2 inches into the subclavian vein and rest right there. And then outside of the vessel, there'll be a little suture that'll be placed tying it to the muscle, and then there'll be a pocket where the electronics will reside, so that the lead will connect to the electronics and it will reside there. It should be a very small incision, so it would lead to a very, very small scar of probably 1.5, 2 centimeters, or less than an inch. And and it will be sealed up. Just surgical glue or Steri-strips or something like that will be sufficient to seal that up, so you don't have to worry about formal sutures and so forth. So that's a bit more, and then you'll be discharged. So the whole thing, soup to nuts, should take about 20 minutes. And then as far as replacements go, we can reuse the same site for replacements in 3 years. And that's about, maybe adds an extra 5 minutes to the procedure.
Paul, it's amazing. I mean, think about the people that after I mentioned, I had to do the finger prick things in the past, that now they get to get something in for 3 years. I mean, it's incredible to me. Here's another one. Jessica from San Francisco wants to know, what has the feedback been from healthcare professionals so far?
Yeah, the feedback actually has been, I would say, a bit segmented, primarily in, there is an older guard, if you will, and when I say older guard, those that are near retirement, and in that, there's been some of the more of the conservative voices. I'd say it's been rather 50-50, out of that near retirement group. Those that are definitely more than, I would say, 5 years from retirement, maybe, or 10 years from retirement. That group, it's been a much larger acceptance rate, very high, super high acceptance rate. And one of the key factors that we hear a lot that physicians really like is how it is, it's leveraging, the cardiovascular techniques that are tried and true. And so that it's that it is indeed measuring in the blood, so that the patients are getting the what should be the most accurate and real-time readings to treat their condition, which should translate, and I keep saying should because we have to do the studies to prove it, but should translate into better glycemic control.
It's incredible. We got one more for you here, Paul. Thanks again so much for being here, by the way. Jackson in Denver wants to know what the next big milestone that people should look for the company is.
The next big milestone would be I would say the implants into the Australian study, kicking that off and having the first cohort of patients implanted with that. And then after that, of course, is following those patients to get readouts on that data and see what that looks like. Yeah, I'd say really kind of like, I know that's the next, I'll say the next three big ones. One is, of course, starting that study with those patients being implanted, then, a readout down the road on those patients. And then third would be IDE approval to start a U.S. version of that study.
Well, that's all the time we have today. I want to thank the president and CEO of Glucotrack, Paul Good, PhD, for an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you, Dana. Dan, I really appreciate it. It's great to see you, and thanks to the audience as well for the great questions.
That was awesome, and I really appreciate all of you for tuning in as well. If you'd like any more information, please go to glucotrack.com. Until next time, I'm Dan Leach saying keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. You too.